Now we start with cocoa. Time for Conservatism, chapters 1 and 2, which covers the merger movement, which we'll get to probably next Tuesday. Maybe Thursday, not Tuesday, I'm sure. This is pages 11 to 56. You might find Coco's not a great writer, unfortunately, but it's an excellent book. You have to slog your way through a little bit. So anyway, I said, you want to talk to me after? You can talk to me after class. Any rate, okay, we get now to oil, one of the great booms of the post-Civil War period, petroleum. It starts, energy in those days, mostly heat, light, was whale oil. In other words, whale oil was the major lamps were whale oil. And did I mention this last time about whales? Yeah, okay. So whales began to disappear. Petroleum begins to come in. 1859 is the first oil well in western Pennsylvania. And we now, the next saga, the next great tycoon in this period, is of course John D. Rockefeller, who's sort of Mr. Petroleum. And like most of the other tycoons, he was born poor. He was born in western New York, and therefore was a pietist. He was a Baptist. His father was sort of, as I said before, was a itinerant patent medicine salesman, sort of guy like a music man, selling elixir of cure of all health or whatever. He always had an interest in health, Rockefeller. His mother was therefore, as many Christian homes in general, the mother was a carrier of transmitter of religious values, brought John D. up in the true pietist tradition. Hard work, not showing your emotions. He's very calm, collected person. Small, beady eyes, not too much expression on his face. And born for thrift and hard work, which of course is a typical so-called Protestant ethic. Save his pennies and all that sort of stuff, and the traditional so-called stereotype. He was also short, once again. He was also thin, short, frail. Of the super tycoons of this whole period, I think J.P. Morgan was the only really tall person, tall of his 6 foot, which in those days was quite unusual. The whole idea of everybody being 6 foot and higher, it only comes in the 20th century with improved nutrition. So he was tall, and he was also commanding presence, weighed about 200 pounds. You know, the sort of guy, it's like in the movie, sort of guy fills the room. He looked like acted like a movie tycoon. Tough, commanding presence. Most of these other guys, however, sort of, you wouldn't notice them if you didn't know they had $1 billion. At any rate, he grows up poor. John D. Rockefeller, he's born in western New York, in the heart of pietist country. At the age of 14, his family moves to Cleveland, and again, of course, Yankee pietist. Grows up in Cleveland and starts off in life. None of these guys went to college. You have to realize college was only for wealthy sons, okay? And didn't waste time going to college. He starts off as a bookkeeper and gets a job at the age of 18 or something as a bookkeeper. And pretty soon becomes a commission grocer. Now, how does he become a commission grocer? He didn't get any bank loan. These guys, they have no credit, there's no bank loan. What he does, he saves money from a small income as a bookkeeper, saves up his money, and starts a commission grocer business with a couple of partners, the Clarks, and gets the money saves up money, borrows some money from his father, didn't have much either, obviously, gets money from friends a little bit, and starts a wholesale commission grocer business. Wholesale grocer. And becomes a sort of a merchant and plows back profits. In other words, the way these guys, almost invariably, these entrepreneurs like Hill and like Rockefeller and like Harriman, we'll see later, these guys really start off, they're poor, Carnegie, and they start working, etc., and they start plowing back profits and borrowing money from relatives, their brother or something like that, and just saving up and plowing back. And he gets... Rockefeller Clark, they start this little, wholesale grocer business in 1858. He's born in 1839, so he's now 19, isn't he? 19 years old, he strikes out into his own commission grocer business with his a couple of partners of his own age. And as he comes along, he finds out that there's the oil business is starting. In other words, in western Pennsylvania, begin to have oil in 1859, and by 1860, and he finds a friend of his, there's a guy named Andrews, who has a small oil refinery. In those days, oil refinery means a small still somewhere. You have to realize it's a very small operation. And Andrews comes to Rockefeller and Clark and said, look, why don't we have and along with the wholesale grocer business, why don't you have a little oil refinery? And get oil from by railroad or something like that, from western Pennsylvania. And so they start up. And as a matter of fact, Rockefeller was sent as a youngster to western Pennsylvania in 1860. He said, there's nothing much going on here. It's a flash in the pan. It's petroleum. But anyway, keeps his eyes open. And by 1862, they expand to wholesale to a refinery, mostly making, of course, kerosene. You have to realize that in those days, kerosene was the only real product. I mean, that was the major thing for lamps. Gasoline was a waste. No use for gasoline. A little bit of residual, not much use for anything else. So when you refinery, of course, you have a fractionated sort of system, especially later on. You can adjust the fractions to some extent. And of course, they made as much kerosene as they could and as little gasoline as they could. No gasoline, just a waste. At any rate, they start a small kerosene refinery along with the wholesale grocer business. And in 1865, Rockefeller realizes this oil thing is a real big thing here. But Clark didn't think so. In other words, so what happens is Rockefeller and Andrews buy out the Clarks. They split the business, in other words. The Clarks, I'm sure to their lasting regret, get the wholesale grocer business. Okay? And Rockefeller and Andrews now set up specialize in refineries. And some of the anti-Rockefeller historians claim that Rockefeller somehow squeezed out Clark. Well, there was no squeezing out. They all saw the situation. Rockefeller and Andrews realized that oil was a big thing. Clark didn't think so, and so Clark's remained with the grocery business. And their tough luck, their lack of foresight. So at any rate, in this situation, so this is 1865, all right? Andrews was a technologist. He was an oil refiner. In other words, he knew a lot about oil refining. Rockefeller was a financier. He didn't know much about technology, but he was a great cost person. Marvelous at cutting costs and improving the finances of the business. And so Andrews was the inside man handling the technology of it. Rockefeller was handling the cost. In 1867, and Rockefeller, by the way, was always great at doing this. He was a genius at finding good people and getting teams of people in. And so in 1867, they expand the business. They include a whole bunch of other people to increase the capital investment and the management team. They get a bunch of people. They have a guy named Flagler who becomes a partner. Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler. And Flagler had quite a bit of money. He's also the son-in-law of Mr. Harkness, who was a big shot, quite wealthy businessman in Cleveland. And so they all come into the business and they start expanding. So by 1867, Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler have the biggest refinery in Cleveland, which is the biggest in the country. Because Cleveland is now the center, just as western Pennsylvania is the center of crude oil, Cleveland is now the center of refinery. You refine the oil and ship it across the Great Lakes. It's a beautiful kind of situation. You have come up western Pennsylvania, first by railroad, and then eventually when the railroads try to increase the fare, the rate, they build a pipeline. In other words, the pipeline is a way to compete with railroads, of course. So railroads can't get you a very high price. And then you ship the thing out, to foreign countries or whatever, the East. So, so in other words, very quickly, by 1867, he's got the largest refinery in Cleveland. By 1870, it's the largest refinery in the world. In a very short period of time, almost all do Rockefeller's financial, business genius. What he does is he cuts costs, he innovates in marketing and in refinery technology and in marketing, and also organization. The first company to have really centralized business control, committee system, all sorts of stuff where you can supervise different parts of the business. Cost cutting, finding ways of coming in with the lowest possible rates of transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So they did a lot of innovation in this kind of in business practices. And with lower costs, you have a tremendous increase in the supply of kerosene. And due to Rockefeller, really the largest, mostly responsible for the boom, and you have tremendous, over time, tremendous cut in kerosene prices. The benefit of consumers, benefit of everybody in the whole business world, as energy gets cheaper and cheaper, due to the expansion of the Rockefeller refinery and the whole Rockefeller system. And along with him come brilliant manager, entrepreneur types. In other words, teams of people who, from that day to this, have always invested with the Rockefellers. In other words, the Rockefeller financial power and political power, as we'll see later, comes not just from his own wealth and his own family, but teams of families who have been with him ever since. The Harknesses, the Flaglers, of course, the Pratts. Pratt was a big Rockefeller Standard Oil person. In 1870, they incorporate, I should finish the task here, become the foremost manufacturing corporation to that point. They're so big by this point, they incorporated the Standard Oil of Ohio, first of the Standard Oil, beginning of the Standard Oil system. Sohio. In other words, these are all partnerships, and this is one of the first manufacturing corporations, maybe the first big one. You have the Harknesses, the Pratts, the Bedfords, Flaglers, etc., and Bostwick, so they continue. The Paynes, I already mentioned Secretary of Navy Whitney was a Payne, and they're still there. In other words, they still invest with the Rockefellers. They move with the Rockefellers. It's like a whole flagship, which gives the Rockefellers enormous financial power, because when the Rockefellers move, this whole group moves with them. At any rate, so we have the whole, and then they build pipelines and a whole marketing system, and really Standard Oil begins the idea of retail breaking bulk and all that sort of stuff. And very quickly, Standard Oil gets the monopoly of the whole world oil market, because they're really the first, very little foreign oil until much later, until the 1890s or so. And so you have, in Western Europe and in Asia, Standard Oil becomes the major exporter of petroleum products. Okay. So you have, to show how kerosene prices fell in this whole period, give you an idea. The enormous benefit to the consumer and the whole economy. You start off in 1863, the beginning of the oil boom. The price of kerosene was 45 cents a gallon. By 1872, 2 years after Sohio was founded, the price of kerosene has fallen to 22 cents a gallon. Okay. By 1874, it's down to 11 cents a gallon. And by the mid-1890s, in other words, at the end of this great boom here, it's down to 6 cents a gallon. This is an 87% drop from 1863 to 1890. Enormous. And those people belly aching about Rockefeller Standard Oil being a monopoly, look at the results of the so-called monopoly. Monopoly means you cut production and raise prices. This is an unbelievable drop in prices as the supply and production increases. This is the kind of monopoly we can all enjoy. You know that. And there are various stories about how he built this up. They claimed, for example, what he tried to do, he wanted to get a monopoly, as I mentioned briefly last time. He tried to get a monopoly of refining. He didn't try for crude oil, because it was too impossible. There's crude oil everywhere. And so he didn't try even for export, for retail business. At one point, by 1879, 1880, he managed to get about 90% of the monopoly, the refinery business in the United States. That was the peak. And he started declining after that. And the reason is, as I think I mentioned, is that he would pay full dollar, for any monopoly. He wanted to buy the monopoly and buy the refinery out. And his object was to raise prices and cut production, raise prices. He was never able to do it, because people would produce refineries just to sell them to Rockefeller, make it as a sucker. Now, the story that grew up by historians is that the way he got a monopoly, or almost a monopoly, is he undercut people. It's called predatory price cutting. In other words, he deliberately cut the price and drove them out of business and then raised the price after that. This is a large businesses are often accused of. It never happens. There's not one case on record of Rockefeller doing that. If you do that, you drive people out of business. First of all, you make losses in the meantime, let's say. If you finally drive the guy out of business and he goes bankrupt, the plant, as I mentioned last time, the plant is still there. The refinery doesn't disappear. Somebody else buys it at auction, bankruptcy auction, gets it for a song, and then competes again. And then you're stuck with the same damn thing again. So Rockefeller never did that. What he did was, the way he got these monopolies, he bought them out. He paid a very handsome price for it. Bought the refinery. And there's a story about a guy, for example, who claimed that he was, the press, the anti-Rockefeller press would say, which is mostly, by the way, Morgan subsidized, we'll get to it later, claimed that a guy named George Price, who was a small oil refiner, and he was victimized by Rockefeller, he's driven out of business. Nonsense. What he did was, he kept going to different areas. He would kind of cut prices against Rockefeller. He'd build a refinery, Rockefeller would buy it, and he'd go 100 miles away and build another refinery, Rockefeller would have to buy that. And he made a lot of money that way. He made, for example, he built a refinery, and Rockefeller wanted to buy and offer $20,000, which of course is worth about $200,000 now, $160,000. And he wouldn't do it. He finally held out for $500,000. Rockefeller had to buy it for $500,000. And finally, this is one of the reasons why he stopped buying stuff. Rockefeller said, hell with it. Why should I pay these jerks what he called blackmail? And he just stopped it. And from then on, the share of Standard Oil share kept going down steadily after that of the oil refinery market. So there were lots of refineries. There were who, even in the 1880s, even in this period when he got 90% of the share, there were about 93 independent refineries who were constantly getting 15 to 20% of the sales. As Standard Oil got bigger, they finally got a whole trust set up. A whole bunch of Standard Oils in many states. There's Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of California, Standard Oil of Indiana, and Standard Oil of New Jersey was the basic holding company, or so-called trust, which they merged into one company, which essentially was the holding company for all the others. Standard Oil of New Jersey became the central part of the Rockefeller empire. In 1899, it was capitalized, it was worth $110 million. That was considered enormous for that period. It's still not as much as various banks, but that was one of the biggest corporations. As Rockefeller began, I have a percentage here. It got a little bit less than this. By the 1890s, it was by 85%. It goes down steadily. I mentioned last time, for two basic Standard Oil, first of all, Rockefeller himself began to retire around 1900. He lived till, he was born in 1839 and lived till 1947, died at the age of 98. And anyway, he was less active after, say, 1900, and his sons took over and grandsons. But anyway, his brother, they began to get bureaucratic. They began to miss out on the shift out of kerosene because electricity came in. And two, the shift into gasoline after 1900 or so as automobiles came in. And Rockefeller and Standard Oil they thought, no, kerosene is always going to be the key thing. Gasoline is a flash in the pan. Electricity is a flash in the pan. They just became bureaucratic. And similarly, they missed out on the Texas-Oklahoma oil boom until quite late, which permitted progressive new small companies like Texaco and Gulf to come in and start cultivating Texas and Oklahoma crude. At any rate, for example, in 1899, 63% of the oil refined of the fraction was kerosene. In other words, as much as possible, they poured stuff into kerosene. By 1919, it was only 15%, the rest going into gasoline. And the fraction of gasoline is at the top of the fraction, and kerosene comes next to that. So it's, residual oil way down at the bottom. So that it's fairly easy to shift proportions between gasoline and kerosene. My father was an oil company chemist, so I grew up on this sort of stuff. At any rate, And as I said, when railroads try to charge a high rate, Rockefeller will build pipelines and then compete on the transportation front. Again, one of the charges against Standard Oil is that they had a lot of railroad rebates, but everybody else had railroad rebates. As I mentioned before, every shipper had rebates. All the other oil refiners had rebates. It was a way of railroads competing with each other down from list price. So by the 1880s, 1890s, Standard Oil had, for example, at their peak, Standard Oil of New Jersey, which becomes the holding company for all the Standard Oils, had 87% of the country's refining. Let's say 1890, 1880s. They had 33% of the crude oil. So that was their peak crude oil production. Never even tried for a monopoly of crude oil because obviously couldn't do it. Okay. Yes, sir. Huh? Yeah, right. It might be, sure. But I mean, the thing is that the point is that from the point of view of the consumer and the rest of the economy, what they like is cheap prices. Huh?
Consumers don't like the low prices.
Yeah, of course they like low prices. Huh? Predatory. No, no, because the predatory price cutting is when you lower the price to drive your competitor out of business and then raise the price. It's a temporary thing. That's the whole point. Price cutting is when you're cutting the price because you have competition. You're trying to get more customers. Right. Exactly. See, one thing businessmen never want to do, they never want to raise the price, encourage new competitors to come in, and then when the price goes down again, they're stuck with the new competitors. You know, that's something that's called an umbrella for new competitors. Businessmen trying to have their prices as low as possible so the new competitors won't come in. They don't want new competitors. And the only way to keep them out, if you don't have a government-enforced cartel, is to have the price low enough so the other profit margin low enough so other competitors won't be tempted to come in to compete with you. So the competition is potential competition, but it's very strong for all that. It's very powerful. Healthy? Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah.
You cannot buy all railroads together. One company cannot.
When was this? Adams? It might be. Yeah. No. Right. No, but I'm talking about competition as potential. In other words, the key thing is you have competitors who are not just there on the spot, but could be there if you make a misstep. If you raise the price above the free market level, let's say, or above the competitive level, other than firms can come in. So the point is you don't even need existing competitors, as long as you have the threat of potential competitors coming in to undercut you. That's all that's really necessary. And you always have that if you don't have the government excluding it. The government doesn't say somehow in one way or the other you can't come in and compete. See, that's what excludes it. So that's really important. And we're coming out of the influence on politics, and what happens very early in the game is that Rockefeller begins to dominate the Republican Party of Ohio. Rockefeller was, of course, a Republican, being a pietist. He begins to dominate it, and through, for example, the guy who was what I'm basically saying, of course, one of the lessons of this whole course, in a sense, is that on the market, the influence of all these people was very healthy, Rockefeller and all these other people. On politics, however, it's a different story. At any rate, Rockefeller becomes, through Marcus Alonzo Hanna, who was a longtime state chairman of the Republican Party of Ohio, and when McKinley ran for president in 1896 from Ohio, Hanna became chairman of the Republican National Committee. Extremely powerful figure running the Ohio Republican Party. And also happened to be a high school chum of Rockefeller at Central High School in Cleveland. As I think I mentioned last time, if you happen to be a friend of Rockefeller in grammar school or high school, you're in great shape for the rest of your life. Okay, high school classmate and chum of Rockefeller. Also head of the Hanna Steel Company, which dealt in the coal and iron and steel business, had business dealings with Standard Oil. In other words, sell coal and steel rails, etc., to Standard Oil. Closely tied in other words, economically and politically and personally with Standard Oil. They picked a guy who was first place, I think I mentioned this, but the Republican nominations for president, from 1876 to 1920, most of them came from Ohio. Remember, Rockefeller begins to get power in 1870 with the founding of Ohio, Standard Oil of Ohio. 1876, Hayes of Ohio becomes president, runs for president, Republican ticket. 1880, Garfield, Ohio, becomes president. 1884 and 88 was Harrison. Well, Blaine was not from Ohio, but Harrison was in Indiana. Okay, 1896, McKinley, Ohio. 1900, same thing. 1908, William Howard Taft of Ohio. 1920, Harding, Ohio. So here you have a very peculiar situation. An enormous number of people coming from Ohio. Now, if you ask the regular mainstream historians, they'll say, well, Ohio is a big state. Well, sure it's a big state, but there are other big states. There's Illinois, New York. Pennsylvania, why didn't they ever get any presidential nomination? Because Ohio meant Rockefeller. In other words, the Ohio Republican Party in that period equaled Rockefeller. McKinley, for example, who was an extremely bright guy, was a congressman, was practically a Hanna tool. He was a stooge of Hanna. He was, as a matter of fact, McKinley went heavily into, he became governor in 1891, governor of Ohio, he went heavily into debt. He actually endorsed the note of some friend of his, it was a deadbeat. And he's almost going bankrupt. He owed $120,000. You realize what that means? He owed $1 million net, equivalent to present dollars. And there's no way he could pay it. He wasn't rich. And so Hanna gets together. And of course, if you're a governor and you go bankrupt, your political career goes down the tubes, obviously. And suddenly the governor announces bankruptcy. Even these days, they couldn't get away with it. So, Hanna gets together with a whole bunch of other industrialists, including Rockefeller, of course, and they save McKinley. They bail him out. They just kick in money to McKinley and bail him out. Hanna himself, Andrew Carnegie was from Pittsburgh, of course. Frick from Pittsburgh. George Pullman, from Chicago, was a Pullman company. They all get together and bail out McKinley. Of course, this means, from then on, McKinley was beholden to Hanna and Rockefeller, obviously. Theirs for life. So at any rate, and they run up for president in 1896. Also, Senator Foraker, who was from Ohio, was not really a Rockefeller person. He was on Rockefeller payroll, and every month he collected a check from Standard Oil from Rockefeller personally, which meant that he voted the correct manner. When Garfield ran in 1880, Rockefeller and Hanna contributed very heavily to the Garfield campaign, etc., etc. Many loans to Foraker and McKinley, in addition to bailing him out from bankruptcy. So what we have, in other words, is essentially a Rockefeller person. Okay, what happens now politically, we have a very peculiar situation now coming into the picture. I've already mentioned at the beginning of the course that I was always puzzled why you had a hot fights over banking and gold and tariffs, which are now issues that can't get people interested in at all. How come everybody's interested? I was related to the ethno-religious aspect, political parties. Another question that comes in, that I was always puzzled about, how come laissez-faire drops out? As we'll see pretty soon in the course. Laissez-faire, which is very powerful, especially in the Democratic Party, all of a sudden drops out. By 1900, everybody becomes a so-called progressive, and the whole governmental system changes and becomes more or less a welfare warfare state that we have today. And nobody sticks up for laissez-faire, and you can say there are various trends that account for it, but this is very sudden. In other words, up until 1896, the powerful laissez-faire sentiment in the United States. After 1900, there's almost none. Now, obviously, it's something peculiar here which needs to be accounted for. And what accounts for it is essentially the disappearance of the Democratic Party as we have seen it, as we have known it in this course until in 1890. 1896 was a catastrophic death of the Democratic Party as a laissez-faire libertarian party. So that's what we have to explore at this point. Well, let's see. Look at my notes here. But what happens? Something happens to the political party structure in the United States. It begins to be obvious to far-sighted Republicans like Rockefeller and McKinley and Hanna that the Democrats were gradually beginning to take over by about 1890. Okay? And some people saw it earlier than others, but this is begins to be clear in 1890, and begins to be clear even before that. For example, I'll give you a couple of instances what happens in the okay. There's a big shift occurs in 1890. In 1888, Harrison is Cleveland loses a very close race for re-election in 1888. Harrison gets in from Indiana, Republican of Indiana, as a dark horse nominee. That's not unusual, a close race bit. In 1890, before 1890, that was 1889, the House of Representatives was 51% Republican, which is more or less classic, very close. The congressional elections of 1890, the House of Representatives becomes 71% Democrat. This is phenomenal. Had not happened since before the Civil War. Phenomenal change. Very sudden. Also in 1890, and the Democrats capture almost every large state. Again, very unusual. Another way to look at it was take the important states of the Midwest. And the Midwest in those days was considered 6 states: Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan. All very powerful, important states. In 1888, the Republicans had 6 governors. Now, of these 6 states, there's only 5 here. What is this? Iowa, all right. 6 states, okay. Illinois, Iowa, all right. Of these 6 states, Republicans had 6 governors. And for the congressional delegation, they had 5 congressional delegations. There was a majority of 5 states in congressional delegations. Democrats had 1. This was fairly standard. In 1890, all the governors and all the congressional delegates, all 6 were Democrats. Very unusual, very sudden upheaval. In other words, there's gradual demographics, as we'll see, but something sudden happens that changes, a sudden trigger that shifted everything in 1890, which, by the way, paves the way for the 1892 when Cleveland not only gets a second term, but captures both houses of Congress for the first time since before the Civil War. We have Cleveland coming in with a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate. It was unusual in that period for the same party to have both houses anyway, certainly for the Democrats. So this is a very unusual, it's a big change happened. Something big has happened in American politics. There's first of all the demographics, or in other words, in the Midwest and in other places, first of all, the Catholics tend to have a higher birth rate than Protestants. And one thing, Catholics usually did not employ birth control in that period. So you had a higher natural birth rate, plus the fact that immigration in this period, from 1870s and 1880s, immigration was largely Catholic or German Lutheran, which was high Lutheran, liturgical Lutheran. In other words, in the Midwest, for example, there's a big decline. Have a question? No. Big decline in proportion of Baptists and Methodists, and a big increase in German Lutherans and German Catholics. By 1890, the Catholics were the largest single religious group in the Midwest. It was not true in 1870, let's say. So you have the demographics gradually building up the Catholics and German Lutherans as a majority, getting to be a majority. This is the general trend. We still have to account for the sudden change in 1890, okay, but over the 20-year period, as I say, far-sighted Republicans began to realize this, and we're in deep trouble here. The same way in the 1850s, the 1840s and 50s, the Democrats were becoming a majority party, but they were shafted by the slavery question, which split the Democrats. But here there's no slavery question. The Republicans realize they're in deep trouble here. They've got to do something. What the Republicans began to try to do, the German Lutherans were the swing vote. In other words, the Catholics always voted Democratic throughout. And the German Lutherans tended to vote Democratic, except when they can be gotten on the Catholic issue. In other words, the German Lutherans hated the German Catholics. In the areas where the German Lutherans did not live near the German Catholics, they voted completely Democratic. When they were living nearby, they started voting Republican. This is part of the ancient law: to know them is to hate them. You live near people you don't like, you start voting against them. So the Republicans, especially the Rockefeller-McKinley people, were quite far-sighted in this thing. I mean, Rockefeller was in favor of prohibition, but he realized that he preferred profits to prohibition and preferred victory. So they began to get pragmatic. So the Republicans, the shrewd Republicans like McKinley and Rockefeller and Hanna, said, look, we got to get the German Lutheran vote. The way to get the German Lutheran vote is, for Christ's sake, drop prohibition. And one thing the German Lutherans hated above all things is prohibition, even more than they hated the Catholics. So, let's say you have the German beer drinking. You know, you leave church on Sunday, immediately you repair to a beer garden. This is German culture, German Catholic and Lutheran. And so they didn't want to have fanatics outlawing beer. So the moderates began to drop prohibition. All right, forget about Sunday blue law, forget about prohibition. We love it. We love you, prohibitionists, but cool it. When they started doing that, they started picking up German Lutheran votes. On the other hand, they started losing their militant prohibitionist votes. See, the Republicans were in deep trouble here. They got more moderate, they pick up German Lutherans, especially if they whip up anti-Catholic sentiment, like the public school system. If you can maneuver it, they started saying the Catholics are a menace to our schools. For example, McKinley won the governorship of Ohio, 1991, I think, bucking this whole trend toward the Democrats by attacking Catholics, by saying Catholics are a menace to the schools. Parochial schools in those days were getting government subsidies. So attacking that, attacking the menace to the school system. They couldn't be very clear about it because they couldn't attack parochial schools per se, because then the Lutherans would get upset. They had to just whip up anti-Catholic sentiment and drop prohibition, which is what McKinley did. On the other hand, they started losing prohibitionist votes. They said, you're selling out. As a result, you had in the 1870s, for example, the Greenback Party, which was pro-inflation and pro-prohibition. All pietists. There was not a single Greenbacker outside of the South. There was no Catholics and Lutherans were Greenbackers. They were all ex-Republicans, ex-pietists, Methodists, Baptists, etc. And then in the 1880s came the Prohibitionist Party, also bitter because of the Republican sellouts they saw it. What happened, for example, just to give you an indication, in 1872, when the Democrats could have been resurgent, the Democrats, like idiots, nominated Horace Greeley for president, who was a Republican anyway, who was a pietist and a prohibitionist and sort of semi-socialist, and immediately lost all the Democratic votes. He was smashed by Grant. It was 1872. And they didn't do that again. So in 1872, in Wisconsin, I think, and in Ohio, the Republicans instituted prohibition, state prohibition. And under the agitation of the Women's Prayer Group, and get this, Women's Prayer League for outlawing alcohol. Women are always in the forefront of the pietism anyway. And so, and in Wisconsin, and Illinois and Wisconsin, they outlawed liquor. Immediately, the German Lutherans beat the Republicans, shifted the Democrats, and prohibition was repealed. So, the moderates, if you want to call them that, the pragmatists in the Republican Party in Ohio and Wisconsin realized, look, we got to drop this liquor crap. We love prohibitionists. We got to shove them aside. Then they set up a prohibition party, and they lose votes that way. But the pragmatists stuck to the idea, look, there are more German Lutherans than there are prohibitionists. So, at any rate, that was the way they try to finesse this. So what happened in 1890? What happened in 1890 is basically the specter of prohibition suddenly hit the year before in the Midwest. In both Wisconsin and in I think Indiana, I think it was, yeah, I think they, no, excuse me, in Indiana, Ohio. This is, in Ohio and Indiana, Prohibition suddenly raises its ugly head in 1889. Republicans are sort of dominant in the state. All of a sudden, what had happened was this. Ohio had prohibited the sale of liquor on Sunday. I mean, all saloons, as they call them those days, and liquor stores. They were shrewd enough not to enforce it in the German-speaking area, especially Cincinnati, which was strongly German. So this is very true. In pietist areas, you enforce it to the hilt. In German areas, the hell with it. So the prohibitionists, of course, got upset at this. They petitioned to the governor to enforce the law prohibiting sale of liquor on Sunday. This is 1889. The governor was Foraker, the prohibitionist anyway. The Cincinnati group, the petition the governor to do this, was called the Cincinnati Law and Order Association. In Cincinnati, among the Germans, they were known as the evangelical stranglers. In other words, they were pietists and stranglers. They're trying to crush liberty. So Foraker says, okay, happy to do this. And he removed the police of Cincinnati, and the states can do this. There's no real home rule unless the states desire it. He kicked out all the police board, they had a board instead of one commissioner, kicked out the board, put in a new board, and ordered them to enforce the law to the hilt. At this point, there emerged what's called the Saloon Keepers' Rebellion. The saloon keepers of Cincinnati rose up, a couple of hundred of them. There's 300 German saloon keepers in Cincinnati said, well, if disobey the law, they're going to sell liquor anyway. That's to you. And Law and Order Associations petitioned for enforcement, crushed them, and so forth and so on. And what happened then is the Democrats shrewdly said, we're in favor of home rule. We want each city and area should be able to have its own kind of liquor law. And as a result, of course, Foraker was kicked out in 1890, and a massive kick-out. The German masses rose up. It was called the Lutheran Rebellion. And 1890, and Foraker was kicked out. Democrats came in and repealed stopped enforcing the ban on Sunday liquor. And so that was, later on, next time I'll go into more of this, but that sort of thing happened in each state in the Midwest. Prohibitionism and anti-German language education. Between the two of them, they managed to disaffect the German Lutherans almost permanently. Not quite permanently, but certainly. There were a lot of people immigrating in this period. But this is the peak, 1880s and 1890s, was the peak of Irish Catholic and German Catholic and German Lutheran immigration. So even though there was Scandinavian pietist immigration, they were outstripped by German and Irish. Also, there was higher birth rate among Catholics and Lutherans than were among pietists. In fact, it's still true. So that the immigration plus the birth rate meant that slowly but surely the Democratic Party was becoming a majority party in the United States. There's also a one-party system in the South, but we'll get to that in a minute, the Democratic ticket. So slowly but surely, the demographics were such. The same thing was happening, by the way, in the 1840s, except at that point, slavery split the Democratic Party in two, and giving room for the Republicans to finally come in. There's no slavery issue now, so it looked as if the Democratic Party was in great shape. And the Republicans then had to do something, and we'll see, for one thing, one of the things which spurred a radical, sudden shift to the Democrats in 1890, when the Democrats took both houses of Congress, took the House by a huge majority, and finally paving the way for Grover Cleveland's in effect landslide victory, especially compared to carrying both houses of Congress with him, unprecedented, in 1892. The way was paved by sudden outbursts of pietist fervor, especially prohibitionism. The Republicans in the 1870s tried to put in prohibition. For example, 1872, and I think in Ohio and Illinois, Wisconsin, and the next year the Germans shifted Democrat, and they learned their lesson. They dropped prohibition. However, the Republicans were caught and had a real problem. On one hand, if they waffle on prohibition, then they'll capture German Lutheran votes. On the other hand, they lose the fanatical prohibitionists and pietist types, who then hive off into third parties. The Democrats always had much greater party loyalty than the Republicans and Whigs. The Republicans were interested in their great moral ideas. And so, if they felt that the Democrats, their leadership was getting a little too compromised, a little too moderate or sellouty, they formed a new party, the Greenback Party in the 1870s, which was an inflationist party. Again, inflation fits in here. Inflation meant the people were getting more purchasing power from the government. Government was paternalistically giving them purchasing power. So either paper money inflation, which was the greenbacks, or later on the free silver agitation, where silver becomes, in addition to gold, the inflationist symbol. And in the 1880s, the Prohibition Party, which is very powerful and takes a lot of votes away from the Republicans. So the Republicans are sort of caught between but they realized the demographics were with the Germans, and so they began to get more and more moderate, especially headed by McKinley and the Rockefeller Empire. And there was Rockefeller, McKinley, and Hanna in Ohio, who were leading the... Rockefeller, of course, loved the pietists, but he said, look, we love prohibition, but profits are more important than morality, quote unquote, and therefore we have to drop these guys. So, at any rate, but they didn't, but in late 1880s comes a big surge of prohibition sentiment. And I've already gone through what happened in Ohio. In Ohio, when they enforced prohibition to the hilt, the Germans rebelled, and in essence the German Catholics and the Lutherans voted Democratic in a landslide. And in 1889, the Governor Foraker, who was a hardcore prohibitionist, was kicked out. 1891, 2 years later, McKinley comes back as governor, but comes back on a very different ticket, drops prohibition. Says, okay, we're not going to enforce prohibition in German areas. In other words, in wet areas, so to speak. Prohibitionists were called the dries, and the people who drank alcohol were called the wets. So in areas in localities, communities where the people who drink, we're not going to enforce it. That was essentially the compromise that the McKinley people put over. And they openly attacked prohibitionists as meddling fanatics and things like that, which is something only the German Lutherans and Catholics would say. McKinley people began to talk in the same way. Also, another thing McKinley did, presaging a very important thing that happened in 1896, which we're leading up to, the climactic year, he began to drop. The Republican Party had always been, since the Civil War, the inflationist party. In other words, a party of greenbacks, paper money, irredeemable paper money, and silver later on. The Democrats were the hard money party, the gold standard party. And it took the Republicans 18 years of kicking and screaming to go back to the gold standard to eliminate greenback money. In other words, we were on an irredeemable fiat paper money standard from 1863 or 52 to 1879. It took 14 years after the Civil War was over for the Republicans to be dragged kicking and screaming back to the gold standard. Even then, it was technically gold and silver standard, and so it was a big fight about silver and gold, and I don't want to get into the technicalities of it. But the Republicans were known as the soft money party, which fits in with pietism, fits in the idea the government should be helping people out to increasing their so-called purchasing power. The Democrats were the hard money party, and so another thing the Democrats wanted to restore free banking. In other words, they want to eliminate the national banking system, which essentially had a centralized kind of banking system susceptible to inflation. In 1891, McKinley shifts his position. This is only in a local level, so it wasn't picked up much by the national, media, so to speak. In Ohio, he begins to come out in favor of the gold standard for the first time. It presages his big shift in 1896 as presidential candidate, because they began to realize that the German Lutherans and German Catholics, the one thing above all else, well, first they're against prohibition. The other thing is they're very much in favor of the gold standard. They hated inflation, purple passion. They're pro-gold because anything else deteriorates the value of their savings. The Germans are a very thrifty group, and they realized that inflation is a way of spoiling their savings. So in order to capture the German vote, German Lutheran vote, which in the Middle West was a great swing vote, two things to do. You drop prohibition, scuttle it, and you start talking about gold. And McKinley was the first one to do that, realizing the demographics of the situation. A similar thing happened in Indiana. I won't go through the, yeah.
What do you say, drop prohibition?
They began to drop prohibition, shelve it, forget it, in other words, put it on the back burner. And they began to adopt the pro-gold position. McKinley was the first one. Beg pardon? No, they began to adopt the gold standard position as a hard money, anti-inflationist position, which was very, very much the major German Americans' economic program. They're very much in favor of gold as the hard money, anti-inflationist party. So that fit in with the pietist, as I've already talked about. The pietist economic program was pro-protective tariff and pro-inflation, part of big government paternalism. Yeah.
Another court. Isn't the pietist the person that believes God?
No, pietist is the opposite. Huh? That's atheist, yeah. No, very, very different. Pietists are very strong believers in a pietist manner. It's different. No, that's atheist. Or agnostic, or whatever. Huh? Well, McKinley begins the shift as an Ohio Republican, not as a national ticket. He begins being a far-sighted politician. He begins to realize that you have to capture the German, in order for the Republicans to win, you have to get the German Lutheran vote. The German Lutheran is a swing vote. In order to get the German Lutheran vote, you have to forget about prohibition and start talking about gold as an important monetary standard. Anyway, in Wisconsin and Indiana, the same thing happened. Prohibition again was the key thing. And in Iowa, also an important middle western state, again, prohibition becomes the key point. Iowa was a state which had never been democratic. It had always been controlled by the Republican Party, always, since the inception, whenever it started, after the Civil War. The other states were much closer. In other words, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin Ohio had been swing states. Iowa had always been Republican. And after the Civil War, Iowa became the subject of intense prohibitionist pressure. As a matter of fact, the Prohibitionist Party really begins in Iowa, and also big was the first big prohibitionist organization was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, extremely powerful group, the WCTU. As a matter of fact, women organized females with a stronghold of pietism, always have been, and they started having, before the Prohibitionist Party was founded, before the WCTU was founded, they had women's prayer groups against alcohol. And they get together and they picket some bar, saloon as they used to be called, and with prayer leagues. And this developed into the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In 1875, they almost captured the Republican Party of Iowa, the Prohibitionists, for General Weaver, who later became the populist presidential candidate in the 1890s. All these groups were very similar. The Prohibitionists, the Greenbacks Party in the 70s, the Prohibitionists in the 80s, the Populist Party in the 90s, all very, very similar. Finally, in 1879, the Prohibitionists captured the Republican Party of Iowa at a convention. They pushed for total prohibition. See, what they had previous to that, they had a statute prohibiting alcohol, but then giving local option. In other words, local communities could have liquor. You still have that in many states, by the way, in the South and Southwest. Different counties will have different local options. With, of course, high license taxes. If you have any liquor store or liquor distillery or something, you have to pay a high tax. These are methods of quasi-prohibition, which you still have in the United States, of course. At any rate, total prohibition had only been put in in two states, Maine and Kansas, both, of course, extreme pietist states, outlawing all liquor, period. Just total. So they tried to do that in Iowa. In July 1882, they had a constitutional amendment. In other words, to outlaw all liquor in the state of Iowa, and was defeated. It passed. A big push. The Temperance Alliance was the main group in favor of it, saying this is morality, Christian morality, and American civilization require the total prohibition of all alcohol. But the Democrats, the Lutherans, and Catholics fought back by saying these are puritanical fanatics, fanatical preachers. Holy Joes is another term often used by Catholics against pietists, and aggressing against personal liberty. The amendment passed by 55% to 45%. It was then outlawed on a technicality. In other words, the Supreme Court said it didn't, some clause that didn't quite work. But the result of this was a big shift of German votes to the Democratic Party. Republicans got a little antsy about this. They went back on a statute. They didn't want to have a constitutional amendment. They favored alienating all German voters permanently in Iowa. So they went back to statutory prohibition. They kept stepping that up. Finally, in 1889, the enforcement kept expanding, an ultra-pietist takes over as governor, of course Republican, in Iowa, and he was an amateur politician. See, once again, the Republicans are not the Democrats, as they believe that you can only ensure personal liberty through a political party system. We're always much more party loyal than the Republicans. The Republicans are much more interested in abandoning the party if they waffle a little bit. So Governor Hutchinson was an amateur politician. He was a grocer who just gone into politics, and therefore he wanted, of course, outlaw liquor to the hilt. And he says in his speech that prohibition is a struggle for morality and for the true devotion of the human race. And this is a hardcore religious thing with him, of course. And he said that it's civilization, the fight is a fight between modern civilization on the one hand and the cursed barracudas of the saloon, as he put it. The saloon, by the way, we'll get to this later on in the course when we get to the urban problems. The saloon, in addition to being the fountainhead of liquor, of course, saloon, you see, used to serve liquor and food at the same time. It was a little bit different from a bar. At any rate, a saloon was, first of all, the social center of all Catholic and Lutheran males. It still is, by the way, in New York or in big city. So what happens is the Irish or German or whatever male, after coming home at night, repairs to the local saloon and spends the whole evening drinking with his buddies and talking politics and stuff like that, socializing. And women do other stuff. But this is basically still is, I think, the Catholic, Lutheran, so-called ethnic social life. And so the saloon keeper becomes the key political boss of his area, because everybody takes their political views from the saloon keeper. He becomes sort of like a local ward healer. So Patty, somebody, the local, who do you vote for, Patty? I'm voting for O'Driscoll, or something like that. Everybody in the neighborhood votes for O'Driscoll. So the saloons were not only the fountainhead of evil to the pietists, they're also the fountainhead of urban, ethnic, political power. And so if they could smash the saloon, they also smashed the Democratic Party ethnic machines. In other words, the political machines or their major political strength of the hated opposition. So it was a twofold thing. One, by attacking a saloon, you're destroying evil demon rum, and also you're destroying the political, social base of the opposition. So in this fight, backing Governor Hutchinson in this fight to crush all liquor in Iowa were, of course, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Prohibitionists, the Good Templars, another temperance group, the Methodist Church, of course, very, very heavy in this. Also another thing I wanted to push to was outlawing all desecration of the Sabbath. Once again, in other words, any activity on Sunday, not going to church, should be outlawed. It's all part of the same shtick. Including, by the way, they want to outlaw all newspapers on Sunday. Because any newspapers, baseball games, and railroads. Nothing should be able to move on Sunday. This is the objective of the pietist fanatics. So what the Democrats did, and they did a very shrewd thing, for the Iowa governorship election, 1889, they picked a former Republican. They picked a guy who himself was a temperance person, and was himself abstaining from alcohol, but was against prohibition. He was against using government force to do it. And so they picked this guy who would appeal to moderate Republicans, so to speak, and Horace Boys. And in 1889, the Democrats won with Boys for the first time in the history of Iowa, won the election by 50% to 48%. And for the first time, the Democrats win the legislature, the Congress, the congressional delegation in Congress. So he was reelected again the following year, 2 years later. So in other words, the Democrats win in Iowa for the first time in the history of Iowa because they're fighting extreme prohibitionists. And anybody who's slightly moderate on the issue shifts to sort of a moderate Democrat and win. So the handwriting is on the wall here. 3 key Midwestern states, Ohio, Indiana, and Iowa, go Democratic on the prohibition question. The prohibition is being taken up by the Republican Party in that area. The other 2 states were swung to the Democrats on a similar question, not on liquor, but on something else. Another pietist concern, of course, was education, as already mentioned. Crush the Catholic or parochial school systems. Force everybody into the public school where they can learn Protestantism. WASP, Protestantism. So in 1889, there's a new governor of Wisconsin, Governor William Hord, Republican governor, who was again an amateur politician. The first time he'd been in politics, he was a newspaper publisher. And fanatical pietist. And he passes a law. Well, first of all, there was a law in the books, a compulsory education law, which was general, had been passed by many states. This is a law, however, requiring, I get this, not only should everybody have to go to school, all education has to be in the English language, even private schools. In other words, outlawing all use of German language in any private or parochial school. And he starts enforcing this. This has been on the books, nobody paid attention to it. It's now enforced. The notorious Bennett Law was passed by State Senator Bennett, outlawing all German language education, what it amounts to. And of course, much of the parochial schools, Catholic and Lutheran, were in German language, since most of these people were recent immigrants. And this not only incensed the German Catholics in Wisconsin, also incensed the German Lutherans. Hey, we got parochial schools, so what is this? And so there's big opposition to this, flaming opposition to an assault on the private school system. And the result is in 1889, when the election comes up, the big Catholic and Lutheran organizing front now is to repeal the Bennett Law. In other words, the Bennett Law outlawing German language education. This is different from the argument now, say, in many states that there should be bilingual education in the public schools. This applies to the private schools. In other words, outlawing all use of German language in the private school system, parochial school system. Beg pardon? Well, Horde was the governor. Bennett was the guy in the legislature who introduced the law. So this is the... in Milwaukee, for example, here's an idea. Milwaukee, which is a heavily German city, and still is, not as much. In Milwaukee, the Republican vote in 1888 was 53%. After the Bennett Law comes into play as the big political issue, I mean, the following year, the Republicans get, 1890, Republicans get only 25% of the vote in Milwaukee. Due to the defection of the German Lutherans. The German Lutherans, I say, are the swing vote. So in 1890, the question is, should Horde get renominated for governor? The moderates said, this guy's a loser. He's going to lose us the state. They try to get rid of him, but he was big pietist and prohibitionist, coming from western and northern Wisconsin, which were pietist areas. From Nils Haugen, who was a Norwegian immigrant, who was, of course, also hated German, being a Norwegian pietist, Lutheran pietist. And not only that, Horde was, again, an amateur politician. He didn't really, he was lashed out. He attacked by name German people. He said Germans are evil and so forth and so on. It's not exactly the thing to do as a politician, even in that period. So, at any rate, he's renominated, and in the election of 1890, Horde was smashed. It was called a Lutheran landslide. Almost every German Lutheran shifts to the Democratic Party, and the Democrats sweep in. Horde is crushed. And the first thing they do is repeal the Bennett Law. The legislature meets. Half the Republicans voted to repeal it. The Republicans are beginning to see that the jig is up. We can't continue this stuff. We got to change our perspective because we're going to be losers. And in Illinois, the same thing happened too. In Illinois, they passed a very similar law called the Edwards Law, outlawing all German parochial German language. Again, the same thing happened. Democrats win. So you have, of the 6 states in the Middle West, 4 or 3 of the 5 states, including Michigan, where something similar happened. 3 states shift Democratic because on the prohibition question. 2 states on outlawing the German language school system question. So the Republicans realize they've got to do something here, and they do something rapidly to try to reverse course. And one thing they try to do is to get rid of prohibition, dump it, moderate it, led by McKinley and led by the Rockefeller people. That's number one. Try to do that. It's difficult to do because the prohibitions are getting more and more intense. The prohibition is getting more and more fierce about this thing. The young people's Christian societies all over the place, begin to pop up, dedicated to pietism and prohibition. The Young Men's Christian Association, the typical pietist group, YWCA, dedicated to prohibition and pietism. Now, of course, it's very innocuous. In those days, there were big, intense propagandists. Also, the Women's Christian Temperance Union got through hygiene courses in the public school system devoted to attacking alcohol. This is another way, another part of the propaganda device. Yeah?
Didn't you call it saloon equivalent to coffee houses in New York?
I don't know. Do they have liquor in coffee houses? In the case they are.
Most of York have coffee houses.
Oh yeah, but this is a.
What did you say? What is the reason why? You gave an example of a person in the Netherlands. They didn't like it here, but it was
Netherlands? Oh, Scandinavia, Norway, and well, the Norwegians and Swedish Lutherans, for various historical reasons, were pietists. They were low church pietists. Whereas the higher Lutherans, German Lutherans, were so-called formalistic. In other words, they're essentially liturgical. Their whole attitude was very close to the Catholic attitude, sacraments and so on and so on. Whereas the Scandinavian Lutherans were very pietistic. They were almost like Baptists and Methodists. Not much difference. There was a split in the Lutheran Church. Right. Exactly. So, anyway, one interesting thing is, for example, in the 1890s, one of the reasons why it was very difficult for Republicans to drop the prohibitionists, 200,000 people, which the Women's Christian Temperance Union set up a Loyal Temperance Legion as a youth affiliate. Okay? In the 1890s, there were 200,000 members of the Loyal Temperance Legion. It's enormous, considering a much lower population then. So, pietists were getting stronger and stronger, and not so much in breadth, but in depth, and there was an intensity of feeling. For example, in 1890, of all the Midwestern college students, now college students, remember, are elite students. They're not, it's not like now everybody goes to college. A very small proportion went to college. These are the sort of the leaders of tomorrow type. 2/3 of all Midwestern college students were pietists, and most of them were members of the YWCA, which then was heavily pietistic. The University of Chicago in 1892, this is really remarkable, which is an elite college even then, they took a presidential poll, as they always do these days, of preferences in the 1892 election. And here you have a poll of undergraduates. There was no graduate school, I don't think. Now, the University of Chicago was founded by Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, as a Baptist. Rockefeller was Baptist, a heavy Baptist aura, but at any rate, they had a preference poll. Grover Cleveland was a Democratic candidate, of course liturgical. The undergraduate preference poll, University of Chicago. Cleveland got 52 votes. President Harrison, who was a Republican of Indiana, got 151 votes. And get this. Another guy named Bidwell, and I can't find his first name. See how important he was in American history. He was a prohibitionist candidate. He got 164 votes. In other words, Bidwell, I guess, wins the University of Chicago undergraduate election. It's pretty remarkable considering we think of college students as being more leftist than the rest of the adults. Here we have a situation where these are ultra-pietists, with Cleveland getting almost no votes. You consider this is like, what is it? Cleveland gets, 15% of the vote or something as a major Democratic party. And the prohibitionists winning out. These are the the leaders of tomorrow. Unbelievable. At any rate, so what happens with the prohibitionists, they didn't know what to do. So they didn't know whether to stick with a prohibitionist party and be a balance of power party. And obviously they weren't winning, because what was happening is the Republicans were getting less and less prohibitionist. Should they stick with the Republican Party, or should they become a single-issue pressure group? And finally, in 1892, when prohibitionists did very badly, and aside from the University of Chicago, on a national scale they did badly, and so they finally decided the way to go was a single-issue organization, which would then reward your friends and punish your enemies. In other words, pick a guy for president or Congress just on the basis of his vote on liquor. And they set up the Anti-Saloon League, which became largely responsible for eventually putting prohibition across. So that was they dropped the Prohibitionist Party. Prohibitionist Party is still around, by the way. They get like 20 votes. Basically, the Prohibitionists dropped the Prohibitionist Party and went to a single-issue pressure group concept. So the Republicans realized we have to drop prohibition. It was tough to do it because they had all these intense fighters, but they did it during the 1890s, led by McKinley and Rockefeller. Then they tried other methods. Well, let's see. What we try to do, let's restrict immigration. To keep it consistent, most of the immigrants are Catholic. If we can keep out immigrants altogether, we'll do well. In other words, we'll stop the demographics from going against us. The Republicans began an anti-immigrant drive. This is aside from the Chinese immigration, which I'll talk about a little later, next time or something, which is a special deal which started earlier. And particularly in the 1880s, I'd say there was a big German and Irish immigration. Then in the 1890s, beginning the dread specter of Italian immigration, even more Catholics coming in. They figured, okay, we're going to stop this. So a big drive by the Republicans to restrict immigration. They started, until 1882, immigration was totally free in the United States, regulated only by New York State or any other state, so it was really essentially not regulated at all. In 1882, Republicans passed the first step in immigration restriction, which is to require every immigrant to pay 50 cents, a 50-cent tax. 50 cents in those days, meant a considerable amount. I don't know, close to $5 now, something like that. That kept out poor immigrants. And also, all ex-convicts were prohibited from coming in, plus anybody who was likely to be a public charge. Anybody who was likely, deemed by the immigration official, might go on welfare or whatever. So this begins the immigration restriction. In 1886, we begin a drive by states. See, those days, aliens could vote. Much different from now. Aliens could vote if they only declare their intent to eventually become a citizen, they were allowed to vote. The the Republican-controlled states began to tighten up on that to prevent aliens not just from voting, but also from being employed on public works projects, government public works projects. In other words, the anti-alien thing begins in late 1886 or so, 87, keep aliens from voting on employed on public works. In 1885, they pass a law outlawing contract labor. This was put in by the labor unions. We'll get to labor unions a little bit later on. Maybe next time after. Labor unions put through a law. In those days, you see, there was contract labor. There's, of course, a labor, quote, shortage, unquote. There's always need more people. There's lots of land and very few people. So businessmen would contract with Europeans in Europe, agencies, to bring people over as contract laborers. This was outlawed in 1885, federal government. Of course, if you outlaw people from becoming contract laborers, it means they're more likely to become public charges. They haven't got a job. In other words, the great thing about contract labor is you know you have a job already when you're coming on the boat. So this way, you're not allowed to have a job in advance, so you're more likely to become a welfare case or whatever. So they could then ban people as being poor because they deprive them of a job. This is great. So first you deprive somebody of a job, and then you say, he hasn't got a job lined up, you have to prevent him from entering the country. There's, of course, particular attacks on Catholic immigrants. It was very explicit. See, in those days, you have to realize, nowadays it's considered at least unaesthetic and probably immoral to be engaged in religious and racial discrimination. In those days, they didn't have these restrictions. People were much franker. And so they said, the Presbyterian Synod in 1887 said we have to keep out Catholic immigrants. They're evil. I think they talk about Bohemian bruisers and Italian cutthroats. And the National Temperance Society attacked Catholic immigrants. They drank liquor. And the Prohibition Party attacked immigrants, Catholic immigrants, and the Independent Presbyterian Church and all that. Another thing that comes into this picture was used by, as anti-Catholic people and also anti-immigrant, the Grand Army of the Republic, the Civil War veterans, means Northern, of course, Civil War veterans, the GAR, who were, of course, all Republican, to the hilt. And they got special jobs. Whenever Republicans got in any state, they would give preference to the Civil War veterans and Union veterans. And so they were in the 1880s, there was their peak membership, 400,000. Enormous number of Civil War veterans, all of whom at the public trough, getting the money, getting the boodle from the Republican Party. They were denouncing immigrants and because they were allied with Copperheads and ex-rebels, in other words, the Democrats, Southern Democrats. There were also flourishing new patriotic secret societies that were anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic. The Junior Order of United American Mechanics, which begins in the 1880s. In 1889, it had 60,000 people. In the 1890s, there was 160,000 people. So these are big organizations. The United Order of Deputies, which had 15,000 workers, And their plea was to all employers, fire all Catholics. No Catholics should have a job in the United States. That was their shtick. Of course, did not succeed. But anyway, that's the sort of pressure constantly. Finally, in the late 1880s, a very powerful anti-Catholic group called the American Protective Association, the Dread APA. Now, when I was growing up in the 1930s, Catholics were still talking about the APA. I think it had faded away by that time. It was an extremely powerful WASP pressure group to protect American institutions from the dread Catholics. And they were founded in Iowa in 1887. There was a secret order, and their secret pledge was never to vote for a Catholic for any position, any position of any sort. It spread through the upper Mississippi Valley towns. It swept Omaha and all sorts of Midwestern states. In 1894, it had 500,000 members, this group. It was enormous, considering this would be equivalent now to at least several million. I'm not sure what the population was at those days. It was obviously much smaller than now. And so that was what happened in the APA was that they were, of course, again, almost completely Republican. They had nothing to do with the Democratic Party. But they had a problem. Their problem was, what do you do about McKinley? They hated McKinley's guts because McKinley was actually appointed Catholics to jobs and stuff like that. McKinley broke very early with this thing. It was part of his moderation or part of his giving up pietism. They tried their best to stop McKinley from being nominated in 1896. We'll see about that later. And they finally, when he was nominated, they didn't know what to do. They really sort of fell apart in 1896. They didn't know whether to oppose him. They couldn't vote for the hated Democrats because they were always tied out of Republicans. They finally sort of began to dissolve. But they were very, very powerful for about 10 years. Another thing was this. The Republicans were and continue to be completely committed to protective tariff, very high protective tariff. Keep out cheap foreign goods. One of the reasons they go in for immigration restrictions is a quid pro quo with the workers. In other words, okay, we recognize if we have a protective tariff, cost of living will be much more expensive. In return for that, we'll keep out cheap immigrants. In other words, we'll increase wage rates of domestic workers by keeping out. So sort of a quid pro quo. Okay, we'll get our goods of our competitors prohibited from coming to the United States, and in return for that, we'll prohibit Italians, Chinese, whatever, from coming into the United States. That was their statist coalition, so to speak. Yeah.
What were the Democrats doing with all this?
The Democrats were opposed to the whole thing. They were in favor of free immigration. They were in favor of Catholics.
Lawrence passed bill, 2 parties have equal rights to make their own judgment.
Beg pardon?
Lawrence passed. There were 2 parties, the Republicans and Democrats.
Well, it depends who's in control of Congress or the legislature. In other words, the Republicans are in control. They try to pass these restrictive laws. What I'm trying to point out here is the Republican Party was in a deep crisis. They're trying to do something about the seemingly inevitable growth of liturgical parties, and one way to do it is to keep out immigrants. They tried that during the 1890s, and they finally dropped it, as we'll see, after 1896. But they're trying to figure out what to do. What to do to redress the balance, what to do to get pietists to win at the polls. One way to do it is to keep out immigrant workers, is to get immigrants, because darn well immigrants are going to be Catholic or Lutheran. Okay. So, another thing was that they tried to restrict another law they passed in 1891. Congress passed. Again, it was during Republican administration, to force steamships. These steamships are bringing immigrants here. To force the steamships, if the immigrant is considered undesirable, let's say is likely to be a public charge or whatever, to force the steamship to carry the immigrant back free. In other words, at their own expense. Now, obviously, this means the steamships will be less likely to carry immigrants if they think that a lot of these people will have to ship back on their own power. So they passed this. Also, they excluded illegal aliens, deporting illegal aliens, to deport them, excluding people with contagious diseases, exclude polygamists. There were such. The big drive on the part of the pietists in Congress came with Senator Chandler of New Hampshire, Republican of New Hampshire, was the big anti-immigrant. And Henry Cabot Lodge in Massachusetts was originally a congressman and then a senator. A Boston Brahmin type, their big push for several years was to outlaw illiterate immigrants. In other words, to make immigrants pass a literacy test. Big drive on that, 1893 and later. And of course, it's kind of peculiar since Native Americans don't have to pass a literacy test. But at any rate, and they set up, 4 Boston Brahmins in 1894 set up the Immigration Restriction League, devoted enormous propaganda to keep out illiterate immigrants. I mean, illiterate in English, of course. They said, these immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe are either illiterates or criminals or both, therefore they should be excluded. In 1896, they passed a law, they finally passed a law in 1896, due to Chandler and Lodge's pressure to outlaw, will force a literacy test on all immigrants. It was then vetoed by Cleveland. It was the last act, well, almost his last act in Congress, just about ready to be kicked out. Cleveland heroically vetoed it, and it didn't pass over his veto. And also, of course, the drive came to prevent aliens from voting. As I said before, a lot of states permitted aliens to vote. They managed to reduce it, but not by much. In other words, in early 1890s, 18 southern and western states permitted aliens to vote. By 1900, only 11 did. But still, it was a slow process. In other words, they put on a big push to keep out immigrants and Catholics. They were slightly successful, but not much. I mean, looking over the decades' work, they didn't get too far. They also tried something else. Okay, if you tried it, in other words, one drive to try to exclude immigrants from voting, or would then later vote. Another drive was to expand the suffrage to people whom you knew would be pietists, namely women. In other words, the women's suffrage drive now comes in as a purely pietist measure. The reason is this: the pietists knew very well that if women voted, if women were given, of course, women were not voting in this period, except in a few of the western states. If women were allowed to vote, almost all the voters would be pietists, because the Catholic culture was such that Catholic women would not vote. In other words, they stayed home. Okay? While the men were at the saloons, the women stayed home and did all this stuff. It's true. It's hard to picture it now, but it's good or bad, whatever it is. I'm not passing a value judgment. But anyway, the culture was such that the Catholic homes, women would not vote. And so the pietists, knowing this, pushed for women's suffrage, and the Catholics, knowing the other thing, voted against it. So this was one of the big reasons for this. So, for example, Professor Grimes, who's written a very good book on the subject, says, I am arguing that the evidence indicates that to a large extent, at least in the West, the constituency granting women's suffrage was composed of those who also supported prohibition and immigration restriction and felt that women's suffrage would further their enactment. The Prohibition Party and the Greenback Party very early came out for women's suffrage. We'll see later that the Progressive Party in 1912 not only had women, but the first group to have women delegates in the National Convention, also a woman elector. And most of the early feminist leadership, the early women's suffrage leaders, came out of the prohibitionist movement. Susan Anthony and Frances Willard and people like that. And they began, in other words, as leaders in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and they shifted over to a women's suffrage movement. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, for example, was involved in the following: women's suffrage movement, women, of course, prohibition, curfew laws. In other words, everybody's got to be in bed by 10 o'clock or whatever, off the streets. Anti-gambling laws, anti-smoking laws, and anti-sex laws. For example, Susan Anthony and Ida Harper, in their definitive history of the women's suffrage movement, wrote the following about the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Women's Christian Temperance Union has been a chief factor in state campaigns for statutory prohibition, I mean prohibition of alcohol, constitutional amendment, reform laws in general, and those for the protection of women and children in particular, and securing anti-gambling and anti-cigarette laws. It's been instrumental in raising the age of protection for girls in many states, and painting curfew laws in 400 towns and cities. The association protests against the legalization of all crimes, especially those of prostitution and liquor selling. And all these things were grouped together by the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the women's suffrage movement. Women's Christian temperance movement, as I said, emerged out of women's prayer, anti-liquor prayer meetings, which began in Ohio and swept the nation. The leading spirit of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Frances Willard, was sort of typical. She was born of New England stock parents who had moved westward to study at Oberlin College in Ohio, which was a center of pietism for decades, center of ultra-pietist leadership. Later settled in Wisconsin. She became corresponding secretary of WCTU and then became the president a couple years later, and then became women's suffrage person and moved in the women's suffrage movement as sort of almost as one and the same. And so there were many Western states, or some Western states, had women's suffrage from the very beginning, and they was almost all put in by these are pietist states and put in by pietists. This is one charming thing. There was a vote for a Colorado referendum about women's suffrage in 1877. It was defeated. And Susan Anthony is testifying before Congress and testifying why it was defeated. And she says, in Colorado, 6,666 men voted yes. Yes for women's suffrage. Now, I'm going to describe the men who voted yes, she said. They were native-born white men, temperance men, cultivated, broad, generous, just men who think. Those are the good guys. On the other hand, 16,007 voted no. Now I'm going to describe that class of voters. In the southern part of that state, there are Mexicans who speak the Spanish language. The vast population of Colorado is made up of that class of people. I was sent out to speak in a voting precinct having 200 voters. 150 of those voters were Mexican greasers, 40 of them foreign-born citizens, just 10 of them were born in this country. It was a bitter attack on Mexican Americans, of course, again, being Catholic, voted against women's suffrage. And the same thing happened in California, where the ultra-pietists were in favor of women's suffrage and so forth and so on. Some of it also is the idea on the part of pietist women. It's a terrible thing to have low-type men voting where they can vote. It was really grated upon. Here they were wealthy and upper-class WASP women, and here were these evil, greasy foreigners, Mexicans or whatever, who could vote even because they were men. That was part of the drive here. Women's suffrage comes in early and mid-90s in the mountain states. We'll talk about that in a minute. The mountain states there were Wyoming and Utah, and Idaho and Colorado, I guess, yeah. These are all mountain states, and they're all mostly pietists. The special thing in Utah was this, kind of interesting. Utah, of course, was heavily Mormon, and the Mormons were in favor of women's suffrage because then the Mormons could outvote the other people. Because the Mormons, every Mormon had 8 wives or something. You have to then multiply the Mormon vote by 8-fold. So, that was their shtick. Another thing about the West in general, a lot of single men tended to be sort of grifters, you see from Western movies, sort of drift in and out of town, sort of unwholesome types. They figured that women can vote and have a more settled family-type voters against the drifter types. That was part of the... Frederick Jackson Turner, I've already mentioned him as the historian who popularized the frontier thesis. You have to realize about him that he was very much in favor of the frontier ethic, including pietism and everything else. To sum that up, he said, there's a great quote from Turner, where he said, in the arid West, that means the prairie states and so forth, he said, these pioneers from New England, in other words, originally New England stock, have halted and have turned to perceive an altered nation and changed social ideals. If you follow back the line of march of the Puritan farmer, we shall see how responsive he's always been to isms. He's in favor of this, remember. He is the prophet of the higher law in Kansas before the Civil War. He is the prohibitionist of Iowa and Wisconsin, crying out against German customs as an invasion of traditional ideals. He is the Granger of Wisconsin, passing restrictive railroad legislation. He is the abolitionist, the anti-Mason, the Millerite. The Millerites were, I shouldn't say crazy, but the Millerites are people who believe that the world will come, Jesus will return on March 1843. And they were first centered in western New York. When March 1843 came and went, and there wasn't no Jesus return, it tended to discredit the Millerites. And they learned from that, by the way, the pre-millennialists, that you shouldn't make precise predictions of that sort, because you might be wrong. The women's suffragist, the spiritualist, the Mormon of western New York. This really sums it up. Now, this is the WASP pioneer, the WASP pietist frontiersman. Because they tried women's suffrage. It passed in a couple of the mountain states, but not very much. In other words, these were gradual measures. They tried immigration restrictions. It didn't work. It worked a little bit, but not much. They tried women's suffrage. It worked a little bit, but not much. And another thing they did, which was more important in the long run, is they put in, the Republicans put in, during 1890, a bunch of crummy mountain states as states. And here are these mountain states. For example, in 1889, 1890, okay, in those 2 years, the Republican legislature puts in as states Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and Washington. And Utah makes it a few years later, 1896. Now there were no people there. You have to realize there are hardly any people in Montana and Idaho now, much less 1890. There are no people. How can they be qualified as states? Notice what happens to their states. I mean, each of these crummy one-horse states has 2 senators. Okay, they're folding in a situation where there are 2 senators from states with almost no people in them. Why do the Republicans do this? Republicans did it because these were all pietists. There were very few Catholics in any of these, or Lutherans in any of these states. These were pietists. They knew darn well these would add to the pietist strength in Congress and 2 parties. And these were all free silver states. They were inflationist states. They all had silver mines, all these states. And silver was the big cry of the inflationists in this period. In other words, we should have silver as money, not just gold. Or stress silver, because silver is more abundant than gold. We have higher prices. So this pietist free silverism plus pietist social values, etc., comes into this picture. So the Republicans were able to fold these 4 states into the picture. This had a longer run more importance than the other stuff, even though it seems to be unimportant. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break. We'll be back and celebrate. That happens in 1896. A big cataclysmic event. But the entire political party system changes. In other words, the party system I've been talking about, the so-called third party system, lasting from 1854 approximately, ends very abruptly in 1896. And the whole party system changes, the whole ideology changes, and the whole ethno-religious support for the parties changes. The question is, what happened? What's the story here? Basically what happens is that something happens to the Democratic Party. Well, first of all, the Republican Party is getting more moderate. In other words, they begin to realize these other things. Women's suffrage was only a long-term thing. Prohibition they're dropping anyway. Immigration restriction was only long-term. They begin to get much more moderate, really retaining basically the protective tariff as their key plank. Giving up, I call it social issues. One of the things, even in the early 80s, for example, in 1990, when the Republicans were still in, they passed the Silver Purchase Law, the Sherman Silver Purchase Law, subsidizing the silver miners of the mountain states, and also, of course, contributing as an inflationary law. When Cleveland gets in, one of his first acts is to repeal the Silver Purchase Act, and to go back to a solid gold standard. One of the things he was supposed to do, Cleveland, was to eliminate the National Banking Act, that was to permit free banking, permit state banknotes, which had been existing before the Civil War. He unfortunately went back on this pledge, probably due to his Morgan supporters. Morgans obviously did not want to have a free banking system. So we have a very different party, a very different party system. What happens in the convention of 1896, it was the Democratic Convention, is that suddenly, and this is of course was brewing for a couple of years at this point, suddenly the Democratic Party is captured by a very different group. And what we have to see is how come this happened. What paved the way for this? The Democratic Party is suddenly captured by an ultra-pietist group. In other words, by people who are much more pietist than Republicans, and who are very much in favor of pure status, in favor of inflation, free silver, government regulation, etc., and prohibition of almost everything. So all of a sudden, the German Catholics, the Lutherans, who consider who've grown up in the Democratic Party, were loyal to the Democratic Party, would never vote Republican under any circumstances, all of a sudden they find the Democratic Party, the party of their fathers, as it's called, has been captured by a monstrous group of extreme pietists. In the meantime, the Republican Party had gotten more moderate under the McKinley Rockefeller influence. Now, how could the Democrats have been captured by pietists when the whole history of the Democratic Party was just the opposite? There was a tremendous shift at the July 1896 convention at Chicago, where the pietists, headed by the famous or notorious William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska, captured the Democratic Party. Well, we can see certain things that happened. First place, one thing, the mountain states have become states, as I said at the end of last hour. In other words, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, and Utah, what's the other state? And Washington have become states. These are all pietists. So they added to the Democratic, pietist strength of the Democratic Party, into the Senate, and all that sort of stuff, the leadership. Another thing that happens is that in the Panic of 1893, well, before I get to that, so when you have the new mountain states, which are all pietists, then you have the South, which has been Democratic, of course, since the Civil War. The Southern pietists, who are not evangelical, they were sort of quiet pietists. They believe that everybody should be born again, but you don't bother anybody else. They were now converted to the Yankee position, where they increasingly become prohibitionists. The Southern Baptists, Southern Methodists, which had held back from this sort of thing for 50 years, and now get converted to these evangelical positions. And now you have the South now becomes pietist. In other words, Southern Democrats become pietists. So this is a big change, of course. This means the whole bloc, the South has become increasingly a one-party state. After the Civil War, blacks in the South were almost all Republican, and the whites were almost all Democratic. After the 1880s, blacks were systematically disenfranchised in the South by the so-called progressive movement in the South. You wind up by about 1900 or so with no blacks voting, almost literally, in the southern states. And now you have a one-party region. In other words, the South now becomes a totally democratic region, and all now becoming pietists. This, of course, shifts the balance within the Democratic Party. Excuse me. If you have a southern mountain, the so-called West, which really means mountain states, as pietists. Another thing that happens is the Panic of 1893, okay, which occurs just after poor Cleveland. I mean, Cleveland gets to be president. In those days, the presidents are inaugurated in March 1st. I think just before he's nominated, just before he takes office, the Panic of 1893 begins with a bankruptcy of some railroad, and then a month or so later, the whole, the bank panic. So you just have the bad luck to come in at the beginning of a bank panic and general depression, brought about, of course, by the previous bank credit expansion and all that, which occurs every 10 years or 5 years or so, due again to this nationalized banking system which was set up in the Civil War. But of course, people didn't realize that. They blamed Cleveland, for the panic. So the result of that, even though the Democrats had swept in 1892, in 1894 they lost the House of Representatives. I think they even lost the Senate. There was a big shift because of the Depression. It was a temporary thing. In other words, the Democratic Party gets discredited for a while. It didn't have to be permanent. But what happens is the people who lose their seats, in other words, in this temporary 1894 shift to the Republicans, the people who lose their seats are the Cleveland leadership. In other words, the libertarian Democrats, so to speak. The big shots in the East, and the governors and senators in the East and the Middle West, who are so-called Cleveland Democrats, lose their seats, which creates a power vacuum in the Democratic Party, because it means the Democratic Party leadership, if you're deprived of Eastern and Midwestern liturgical types, people who are laissez-faire, hard money, free trade Democrats, this means that there's a power vacuum open for the Southern and mountain people to take over. It just so happens that the bad luck was that the 1894 collapse of the Democrats because of the Depression, which is purely temporary, leaves the path open for the Bryanites to take over in 1896. So as a result, in 1895 and 1896, in the individual states, the Bryanites begin to take over the different state parties. This is not really so what happens is Bryan begins to put together this coalition of ultra-pietists, southern pietists, mountain state pietists. There's a vacuum in leadership in the eastern Middle West, and he takes over the convention in 1896. This is a big blow, but you could see it was coming, and they would begin to be able to predict it by the early 1896. It's something, a cataclysmic change was going to happen in the Democratic Party. As a result of that, the Republicans begin to see the handwriting on the wall, of course. It looks like the Bryanites are going to take over. The Republicans then systematically start dropping, even more so, all the pietist stuff that they were saddled with, prohibitionism and anti-Catholicism and anti-Germanism and all the rest of it. And the Morgans, who had been first practically running the Democratic Party, begin to realize the Bryanites are taking over. The Morgans were committed to the gold standard at this point. And so the Morgan forces in the Republican Party start dickering with McKinley, the Rockefeller forces. The Morgans were pushing, the Republicans had their convention, I think, in June, in other words, a month before, in St. Louis. And the Morgans were pushing for Levi P. Morton to become presidential nomination. Levi P. Morton had been the vice president on the Democratic ticket, in other words, in the Cleveland administration. He was the the first one. New York Democrat, head of the Morton Trust Company, very close friend and buddy of J.P. Morgan, who later became, the Morton Trust Company later becomes part of the Morgan Guaranty Trust, which is now, of course, the big Morgan bank, commercial bank. Anyway, very close buddy of Morgan. He shifts parties in 1896 because they see the handwriting on the wall. The conservative Democrats, the libertarian Democrats, see that the Bryanites are taking over. And they push him to the Republican nomination. Well, McKinley, the Rockefeller people are behind McKinley. Okay? So they have a big, high-level negotiations. Mark Hanna and McKinley go on Morgan's yacht. I think they had 2 meetings on Morgan's yacht, but they had a big yacht, you might expect. And they're discussing the whole situation. And Henry Cabot Lodge was one of Morgan's top people in this thing. And anyway, they strike a deal. The deal is this. Morgan said, look, you got to adopt the gold standard. You've got to be committed to the gold standard. If you're committed to the gold standard, then we'll back McKinley for the presidency, because we can't, of course, take Bryan. If, on the other hand, you don't accept the gold standard, that's to you. We'll either form a third party or we'll drop out or whatever. And so the deal was then struck. The Republicans, for the first time in the 1896 convention, adopt the gold standard as a commitment, as a basic commitment. In other words, they accept the anti-inflation plank, which the Democrats have been fighting for now for 70 years virtually, at least say 50 years. And this was a big thing. It was also a big thing of the Germans. Remember, the German Americans, both Catholic and Lutheran, placed their two things they're mostly interested in. One is stopping prohibition, and 2 is the gold standard. And here the Republicans finally are committed. They're dropping the prohibition stuff. They're saying, hell with it. And they're pushing the gold standard. Now, the Silver Republicans, who were committed to free silver, split from the party. I think the split was organized by Senator William Teller of Colorado, who was himself one of the founders of the Republican Party, who was, he and his mountain state Republicans, both the convention, they formed their own party called the National Silver Ticket. Teller, by the way, himself has owned $2 million worth of silver mining stock, and so forth. Particularly his interest in silver was more than just abstract. Anyway, so the Silver forces did leave the Republican Party, and they supported Bryan and formed their own fourth party ticket. But these are a small price to pay for German Lutheran support. And as a matter of fact, with the Silver Republicans gone, the McKinley people could say, we are the gold standard party. Interestingly enough, most historians, when they deal with this period, talk about the Republicans as being the gold standard party, not realizing this only happened in 1896. Before that, it was just the opposite. So McKinley, in other words, gives up prohibition, adopts the gold standard. In the meantime, Bryan takes over the Democratic Party as an ultra-populist, ultra-prohibitionist person, ultra-inflationist. So As a matter of fact, the first step at the Chicago Convention, the Democrats, the first vote was, should we honor Cleveland? After all, Cleveland's still the president. Okay? He's had 2 terms in office. There's an anti-third term tradition. So he's not going to run. The first vote was, should we honor Cleveland? So, which is sort of a thing. You almost always do that. But it was voted down by the Bryanite Convention. When that happened, of course, Cleveland people knew the jig was up. As a matter of fact, the Cleveland people, from then on, Cleveland and his supporters kept saying the Democratic Party is dead as we know it. That was the party of our fathers. They would put it as dead. Bryan was a Southern stock pietist born in Southern Illinois. He was a Southern Baptist. He was, of course, a great believer in compulsory morality and safe social atmosphere for the righteous and prohibition and all the rest of it. So, of course, as I say, then the question is, what do the laissez-faire Democrats do? Okay, what do they do about this? Bryan is taking over the party. Now, it seems to me if they had any guts, they would have formed a third party. They said, okay, the Democratic Party is taken over. We form hereby a laissez-faire party, whatever you want to call it. They didn't have the guts to do it. Some of them wanted to do it. Others said, well, we don't know. Maybe we should be pro-McKinley. Some of them did form a National Democratic Party called the Gold Democrats. But only a few of them. And they didn't have the guts. They didn't want to. The Eastern Democrats wanted to keep their control of the Eastern Democratic Party, which they lost anyway. And so the whole thing sort of fell apart. But basically what happened was that most liturgical Democrats, Cleveland Democrats, voted for McKinley. In other words, the bargain was struck. McKinley's not so bad anymore. He's given up prohibition. He's pro-gold. And so there's a big, enormous shift by German Catholic and Lutherans to the Republican ticket for the first time. Polish Catholics have been dedicated Catholics. Many of them voted Republican. Huge shift both ways. There was a huge shift out of the Democratic Party by Catholics and Lutherans, and a big shift into the Republican Party into the Democratic Party by pietists, Scandinavians, all that sort of stuff. The shift was more pronounced. Since the Republican Party change was more gradual than the Democratic Party, the shift out of the Democrats was more severe. In other words, a big, enormous shift. There was also a counter shift of pietists, prohibitionists. Matter of fact, the prohibitionists more or less liquidated themselves into the Republican Party, into the Democratic Party, as the populists did too. They just became Democrats, basically. So the whole ethno-religious thing shifted. And something else happened. See, the old days, there was no rural-urban split. In other words, there were lots of farmers who were Catholic and Lutheran and et cetera, et cetera. There's no big urban-rural split as there is now, even. Most historians talk about the Bryanite movement as if it's an upsurge of all the farmers in the country against the rich. Okay? If it was really true there was a big upsurge against the rich, how come Bryan was crushed in the general election? He was crushed 3 times, as a matter of fact, 1896, 1900, 1908. If you had a mass popular uprising, because most historians tend to be pro-Bryan, being left liberals, they identify with Bryan. If Bryan represented an upsurge against the rich, against big business, how come Bryan was always crushed every year? There's something wrong, peculiar about this. Also, farmers did not vote for Bryan particularly. Again, the breakdown is Catholic and Lutheran farmers voted for Republican, and pietist farmers tended to vote for Bryan. It's a very simple breakdown, ethno-religious breakdown, except now it's just the opposite from the old days. So, what happens to the Democratic Party from now on is, from then on, it begins to become the ethnic group which least defected from the Catholics is the Irish. In other words, the Germans defected en masse, the German Catholics and Lutherans, and the Bohemian Catholics and whatever. The ones who really stuck to the Democratic Party were the Irish. Basic reasons the Irish essentially went into civil service. In other words, the Irish immigrants that came to the United States, for some reason became civil servants. They became sanitation workers, public school teachers, policemen, and firemen. Okay, and so they were. In those days, there were very little civil service. In other words, most of the jobs were patronage jobs. If you left the Democratic Party, it means you're out of a job. You couldn't afford to leave it. So the Irish stuck to the Democratic Party. As a result of that, the Democratic Party, from now on, after 1896, begins to become a 2-wing party. One, the South, okay, and 2, urban Irish machines in the city. In other words, essentially the Northern Democratic Party gets taken over by the Irish, who become governors, mayors, senators, etc., etc. The WASP Democrats, previous the Cleveland types, get kicked out, and the Irish take over. As a result of this, this tended to alienate other successive ethnic groups, like Italian Catholics, who didn't particularly like Irish, so they began to be tempted by Republicans. In other words, over the years from then on, Italians no longer solidly democratic as Catholics would have been, before 1896. So you have a strange situation where you have the Democratic, we begin to get then, in other words, after 1896, completely new party system. The Republican Party becomes the majority party. It's no longer a big, very close race, except for Woodrow Wilson. Yeah. That's right. Exactly. You'll see, I'll see some great quotes, huh? Oh, of course not. But no. Beg pardon? Well, the gold standard has been given up by all the power elite at this point, and the Germans unfortunately have forgotten about the gold standard. Well, it's oh no, that's not true. Well, you have a little different situation now. Since World War II, the Rockefeller-Morgan types essentially run the establishment of both parties: establishment Democrats, establishment Republicans. Whereas, say, Reaganites are more the Sun Belt, South and West, essentially Texas and Southern California, the Sun Belt type. This is post-World War II development. Before World War II, the Rockefeller-Morgan breakdown more or less holds. Since World War II, it's very different. The Morgans have become junior. Quiet, please. Hey, quiet, please. Before World War II, right now, since World War II, the Morgans have become junior partners to Rockefeller. They're not nearly as strong. The oil has become predominant in the Eastern establishment. But before World War II, it was very different. So the whole thing. Oh yeah, of course there's no Murray Rothbard. Absolutely. Oh yeah. My goodness. Let's put it this way. In the Eisenhower administration, okay, the Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles. Okay? Head of the CIA, which in those days had almost equal power. It was a secret organization, no accounting anybody. It was Allen W. Dulles, his brother. And the head of the Berlin desk of the State Department was Eleanor Lansing Dulles' sister. All right? Now, the secretary, who are the Dulles family, okay? Is it really true in the whole United States with a lot of talent, one lousy family should run the entire foreign policy of the United States? Okay? Who are they? In addition to being beloved people, who are they? Well, both Dulles brothers were lawyers for Sullivan and Cromwell, which was Standard Oil lawyers, known as Rockefeller lawyers, okay? Also, the Undersecretary of State, which is the number 2 position in the State Department, held by extremely beloved Representative Christian Herter of Massachusetts. By beloved, I mean the sort of person who's beloved by New York Times, Newsweek, and Time magazine. Sort of people praised by this sort of group. So Christian Herter was Undersecretary of State. Who was Christian Herter? Well, he was a former Republican congressman in Massachusetts who had a lot of charisma, 6'6" or something, and had a bad foot, so he limped. It made him a romantic figure. Anyway, it was really important was he was married to a Pratt, and his wife was a member of the Pratt family, which has been a Rockefeller family since 1880. Okay, so Standard Oil family. So the whole Eisenhower foreign policy was Rockefeller foreign policy from the beginning to the end. That's of course a fairly bold example. But the Carter administration was also a solid Rockefeller from the Trilateral Commission. So it doesn't have to be, it can be both parties now. So the Rockefeller is still very strong, much stronger than Morgan. Morgan's now sort of, let's say, junior partners to Rockefeller at this point. Post-World War II oil come in as a big thing. At any rate, to get back to 1896, the gold becomes the key point. So what happens then, the Democratic Party after that becomes a one-horse party, basically a minority party. Republicans become the majority party, no longer in close elections. This lasts from 1896 until 1932. Except for the Wilson administration, where the Republican Party was split down the middle for Rockefeller-Morgan reasons, by the way, we'll see. And the Democrats become a minority party consisting only of the South and Irish, New York, big city machines. In other words, New York, Boston, whatever, which are essentially Irish and Irish parties. So we have the South plus Irish big city. Okay. By the way, the one funny thing was the Democratic Convention of 1924 which was held in New York City in the summer. First, they have to realize there's no air conditioning then. They had 104 ballots. I mean, it went on for weeks. A very hot, old Madison Square Garden. Southern Baptist and Methodist pietists coming up and confronting New York Irish types, scared stiff of the Jesuits, because the Jesuits were behind every tapestry, every arras, thinking the Jesuits would knife them at any moment. Unbelievable culture clash between the Southern Democrats and the New York and the big city Irish Democrats, arguing about prohibition and lots of other things. The Irish never accepted prohibition, obviously. By the way, prohibition comes in the Democratic administration during World War I. Wilson was then. So all this women's suffrage comes in the Democratic Party. Immigration restriction comes in with the Democrats. And prohibition comes in. The Republicans, in other words, drop it. After they get in, they figure we're the majority party. We have to putz around with prohibition and this other nonsense. Well, the heck with that. We're in, and we're going to be in from now on. So that was the Republicans then, as I say, become the majority party, except for these fringe groups, really, is what it amounts to. The Democrats become, so we have the Republicans as a centrist party. In other words, not ideologically strong, so sort of middle-of-the-road party in general, except committed to protective tariff. And the Democratic Party, after a fling with the ultra-pietists, sort of begin to drop that, and they both become progressive. In other words, after 1900, they both become statist parties, moderate statist, what you want to call it, in other words, so-called progressive. It becomes, in other words, very little difference after about 1900 or so between Republicans and Democrats, except for this lingering ethnic or southern, regional orientation. So this is the so-called fourth party system, 1896, 1832. And the thing about the fourth party system, which continues to this day in the fifth or sixth party system, wherever we're in, is the parties are no longer ideological. In other words, the parties now become like we know and love today. Very little choice. I put love in quotation marks. Becomes non-ideological. The people begin to lose interest. In other words, the turnout rate, that means eligible voters to turn out to vote, which was very high in late 19th century, very high in 1896, very high before that, like 90% for presidential elections, begins to drop. The people don't really care that much. It gets to a point that two parties become very close together, and people lose interest. As the people lose interest, it means that this explains why there was no laissez-faire party after 1896. There's no body of people fighting for free trade, free markets, and all that sort of stuff. And this leaves a power vacuum open for progressivism or the welfare state, the warfare state, whatever you want to call it. In other words, after the takeover of 1896, the laissez-faire people lose their party. If you lose a party in those days, it means you lose politically, period, because there's nobody coming in to free fuel, continue the agitation, propaganda, whatever. And so this, in other words, explains why it is. I was always puzzled by the fact. I can understand why statism takes over after 1900. The intellectuals become statists, big businessmen become statists, as we'll see. But what happened to the Democratic Party? What happened to this party, which is a bastion of libertarian, laissez-faire sentiment? Well, what happened was they got taken over. And so the party system then loses its point as an ideological spokesman, and the whole system then, since party voting becomes less important, that means the technocrats begin to take over. Administrators, bureaucrats, intellectuals, they begin to take over without the parties being a check on them. In other words, democracy really loses a lot of its savor because it means you don't have a powerful party system riding herd on the other parties. I mean, for example, and if you do have two parties, they collaborate. For example, how come the Queen's Republican Party says nothing about the Queen's Democratic trickery here? They haven't said a word. They probably won't because they're all in cahoots together anyway. There's no antagonism. It's not like the good old days. Remember, each party hated each other's guts. Now there's nothing to hate them. It's just a bunch of sort of crooks in it together. So why rock the boat? You don't have the great ideological passions that you did when you have pietism versus laissez-faire, that sort of stuff. That's all a shot from 1896 on. Anyway, some marvelous, some lovable stuff. I just want to quote one thing here about the reaction of the Germans to the take to the Bryanites. I think is extremely lovable here. Where is this? Wait a minute. Later, but not it. Okay, this is an idea of what happened, for example, in Wisconsin, a heavily German state, in 1896. Okay, for example, in a couple of townships where the very heavily German Lutheran in Wisconsin, there are two townships where the thing is striking. The other parts of the state aren't that striking, but still, one is Hustisford Township, Wisconsin. The other is Theresa Township. And in these two townships, in 1892, these are all just solidly German Lutheran. That's how we can know how the Lutherans voted, because these were all people settled here. It was not a melting pot in the United States. It was a mosaic. Every little parish was different. So this township, which was solidly German Lutheran, okay, in 1892, the vote was 85% Democratic, enormous, 91% in Theresa. It was almost unanimous. In 1894, because of the Depression, there was a slight falling off. 82% Democrat, 81% Democrat. But still very solid. In 1896, because of the Bryanite takeover, Hustisford Township voted 46% Democrat and 43% for Theresa. Enormous. I mean, dramatic shift. They never voted Republican in their lives. And the state as a whole, the whole state of Wisconsin, and the German Lutherans voted 85% Democrat in 1892. In 1894, they voted 59% Democrat because of the Depression. In 1896, they voted 30% Democrat. Massive shift because of Bryanism. One very charming thing is there was in Milwaukee, running for Democratic congressman, was a guy named Richard Schilling. He was a Bryanite. He has a meeting before the German masses of Milwaukee, trying to explain to them what now be called Freemanite or Keynesian monetary theory, namely, why you don't have to have gold as the money. And he says, you don't have to have gold as money. Anything else would do just as well as gold, he said. The German masses of Milwaukee. He said, you could have silver as money, you could have paper or copper or paper or sauerkraut or sausages. Could do just as well as money. At that point, the German mass in Milwaukee hooted him off the stage, threw eggs and cabbages and all that at him, drove him off the stage. The Republican Party, now being committed to gold and being very shrewd, immediately coined the slogan, Schilling and sauerkraut money, and swept Milwaukee for the first time in many years for the Republican Party. So that's the sort of stuff that happened. It was and not only that, but the Johann Most, who was the German head of the anarcho-communist anarchist movement, which was German. And don't forget, the communist anarchists were in favor of abolishing all money, period. The compulsory abolition of all money. He came out in favor of the gold standard in 1896. I think it was charming. So dedicated to gold with the German masses, he finally had to come out. He too was in favor of the gold standard. As the Illinois Stadtzeitung said in 1896, the German-American paper in Illinois said, looking back on the election, on the German electorate, they said, the Germans have had many complaints against the Republican Party, which annoyed them continually with prohibition laws, Sunday school laws, Sunday closing laws, and school laws. The Germans consequently turned their backs upon the Republicans. The result that Cleveland was twice elected. And if the Democrats had not inscribed repudiation, bankruptcy, and dishonor upon their colors as a result of their union with the populace, I mean, Bryan, the Germans would have supported them this time also. So that was as I say, that was the kind of a hallmark of the shift, the democratic shift. And we get into a fourth party system, a very different, non-ideological party. Republicans winning most of the time. And this only changes with the New Deal, in the 30s, when we get a Democratic Party system, basically, lasting another, until, say, the 70s. Okay, that's enough for today.